So I'm going to share with you now a tool. I'm going to share with you a method, and you'll get this in writing, and you'll be able to use this tool to prepare communication. You can use this tool to prepare communication to an audience of one. You're briefing the commander, you're briefing the boss, you're briefing the president, you're briefing the Secretary of Defense. You can use this planning tool to prepare to communicate with an audience of one. You can use this planning tool to prepare to communicate with an audience of dozens, with an audience of hundreds, with an audience of millions. The planning tool doesn't change. It's the level of detail and the number of iterations you need that changes based on how big the audience and how heterogeneous the audience may be. But the planning tool doesn't change. And if we are serious about influencing outcomes through communication, then there's a 5-step process to getting ready to communicate. There's a 5-step process for getting ready to communicate. And most ineffective communicators, and therefore most purported leaders, typically begin at step 5. Typically begin at the 5th step, and they never consider the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, or 4th. And I'd like you to imagine whatever rigorous process you do in your primary occupation. And I'm going to ask you what happens if you start on the last step in preparing your work compared to starting on the 1st step when you're starting your work. And my prediction is it won't go very well. So we need to start at the 1st step. And then we need to move to the 2nd step. And we can't skip steps. It's only after the 2nd we move to the 3rd. It's only after the 3rd we move to the 4th. And by the way, the 4th is the really hard one. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd are pretty easy. 4th is really hard. We'll get to that in a minute. So what are those steps? The first is to have clarity of purpose. Because communication is the continuation of policy by yet other means. Until we have clarity about the purpose to achieve the policy, it's going to be very hard to effectively plan that communication. The 2nd step is the people. Who is it that we need to engage in order to move towards the fulfillment of that purpose? And the discipline is to write it down. The discipline is to not do this informally, but to write it down. 3rd step. What is the change you seek in the people you hope to move? And again, the discipline is to write it down. These 3 steps are relatively easy. These 3 steps are very straightforward. All it requires is clear thinking, a little bit of insight, but it doesn't take a lot of time and it doesn't really take a lot of work. What takes time and takes work is the 4th step, and that is figure out as much as you can about what matters to the people you're trying to influence. Figure out as much as you can about the people you're trying to influence, and there's a series of questions you can ask that get you quickly to at least an understanding of the content you need, of the understanding you need, and we're going to go through those questions in a moment. It is only after you've done those 4 steps that you are in any way ready to then prepare the mechanics of the communication. Most people begin at step 5, and most people these days begin step 5 with a PowerPoint deck. I see some smiles. If you begin step 5 with PowerPoint, the likelihood is very high that you're not going to successfully move people. It's not that there's anything wrong with PowerPoint, but it shouldn't be the first thing you move to. It shouldn't be your first resort. And I also offer as lovingly as I can that the term is PowerPoint, not every point. Yeah, you're welcome for that. You can have that. Yeah. But all too often, we present something we call a PowerPoint, and it really is every point. And what is the likelihood that that every point actually achieves your purpose? Thank you, ma'am. I see a very sad shaking of the head. So let's go through these one at a time. The first, What is the goal that the communication you plan is intended to achieve, and you have to state it in terms that have nothing to do with the communication. Tuesday is not a purpose. So what is the policy goal that you're hoping to attain? And get as much granularity as you can and write it down. Because everything else is going to be measured against the likelihood that it will move you closer to this policy goal. Because means can never be considered in isolation from their purposes. This is the purpose. And we measure against the achievement of purpose. That's not hard, but it requires clear thinking and discernment. The second is to think about the people. Think about the people who matter. The people who can move you either directly or indirectly or right away or through a series of interactions closer and closer to the fulfillment of that purpose. And write them down. And if there are multiple categories, write down each of those categories. And if there's really important nuances of difference even within categories, write those down. Have as much granularity about how heterogeneous your audience may be, because if it's heterogeneous, you're going to have to connect with each subset on its own terms, and that just means the communication has to be far more robust. The good news is the people for whom something doesn't matter will ignore it when you say it, but the people who do need to hear a certain thing will notice it when you say something that connects with them. So if you've got 17 different subsets you need to connect with, so long as you have something for each of the 17, they will likely hear what they need to hear, and the other folks will ignore all of that other stuff. But if we have 17 subsets, we need to be able to connect in 17 different ways. That's hard. But it begins with having clarity about what the heterogeneity in our audience may be. The third step is to target the change in each of those subsets of audience. And we target each subset of audience by asking very basically, when we're done, how do you want them to change? What do you want them to know because you engaged them that they otherwise would not have known? Write that down. The discipline is to write it down. What do you want them to think that but for your engagement with them they would not have thought? What do you want them to feel that but for your engagement with them they would not have felt? And then finally, what do you want them to do that but for your engagement with them they would not otherwise have done? And you need to answer this question for each subset of audience. And this is where it gets a little complicated. This is where your ability to manage very complex systems comes in handy. But what will work for one group will probably not work for another group. So you have to have clarity about each of the groups before you figure out what is likely to work for each of them. As I said, these first 3 steps are relatively easy. It just requires clear thinking and careful discernment. It's the 4th step that is really hard. And in this 4th step, we ask about each of those subsets of audience. First, what do they care about? And there are 4 kinds of questions we can ask that gets to what do they care about. The first is, what are their values? What do they as a group have in common about the things that motivate them day in and day out? What are their values? The second, what are their long-term hopes? What are their aspirations? What do they work towards? The third, what are their fears? What are their deep fears? What are their surface anxieties? And it's critically important to inventory their fears. It's critically important to inventory their anxieties, because those fears and anxieties are barriers. And if we don't have clarity about the fears and anxieties, we may miss a barrier. And we may end up throwing communication at something that isn't going to get through. But we can also use those fears and anxieties as motivators, because we can resolve the fears and we can resolve the anxieties. And then finally, what are their short-term wants? What are their short-term wants in the immediate term? The more clarity we have about values, about long-term hopes, about fears and anxieties, and about short-term wants, the more likely we are to figure out how to connect with them on the things they care about. But we're not done. First is we need to do this for every subset. So the more heterogeneous the audience, the more of this work we have to do. And one of the consequences of this planning is we may conclude that we shouldn't try to connect with all of these subgroups at the same time. We may conclude that it's just too complicated, or that things cancel each other out, and that's a good outcome of the planning tool. If the planning tool outcome is, ooh, maybe I shouldn't do this communication the way I had planned, or the way I thought I would do it, then that's a good outcome. Maybe you need 2 different forms of communication, 2 different subsets of this audience. Or you may need 4 or 9, but you won't know that until you go through this 4th part of the audience analysis. If the hopes, fears, values, and desires are so different among the subsets of these groups that there's no one communication that can actually achieve all of them, then split it into multiple communications. We're not done, though. We then need to ask, how does this audience choose? How do they make decisions? Do they need evidence? If so, you'd better have evidence. Do they need logic? If so, you'd better have logic. Do they need emotional resonance? If so, you'd better have emotional resonance. Do they need third-party validation? If so, you'd better have a third-party validator. Do they need someone they deeply trust to be the messenger? Then you need to identify that they need somebody they deeply trust to be the messenger, and it may not be you, and you need to know that in advance. Because if you don't ask that question, you might end up being the one to communicate and they don't trust you, in which case that communication isn't likely to work. So how do they make choices? If you're presenting to a committee and you want the outcome to be the approval of something, how does the committee decide? Is it a vote? Do they need consensus? Is it a majority? Is it a simple majority? Is it only the illusion of a vote, but there's one person in the room who actually makes the decision, but wants other people to believe they have a role in that decision? The more clarity you can have about how any particular group decides, the more likely you are to actually be able to connect with them. And then the last set of questions, and this is the one that most communicators fail, most leaders fail to ask, and that is, what will prevent them? What will prevent them from thinking, feeling, knowing, doing? What are the barriers? Some of the barriers are physical. They can't hear us, they can't see us. And in my corporate work, I often say to my corporate clients that the single most prevalent form of business communication is also the least effective, and that is the conference call. And I see some of you smiling and nodding your head. I've not been on any military conference call, so I can't judge military conference calls. But I can say this about the conference calls I've experienced. There's a dirty little secret in conference calls. And that dirty little secret is this. Every single person on the end of the call is doing something else while you're talking, including you. The dirty little secret of the conference call is everyone on the call is trying to be efficient and do other stuff because they're really busy. And as a result, they're really not paying attention to whoever is speaking. And that's a barrier. And if you're going to be engaging through a large number of people on the same phone call, unless you adapt how you engage them, they're not going to hear what you have to say. Because there's another dirty little secret, and that's this. There is no such thing as multitasking. There is only the illusion of multitasking. There is serially tasking in microbursts. So when you're doing this while purportedly listening on a conference call, you really aren't hearing what's happening on the conference call. So one of the ways that an effective leader on a conference call adapts is recognizing that everybody's doing this while he or she is speaking, to not say anything important without saying you're about to say something important. So the next thing we need to really focus on is everybody stops typing and looks up. And then you say it, they nod their head, then they go back to typing. Until you acknowledge that the conference call is a barrier, you will not know to adapt on the conference call. But you need to acknowledge that the conference call is a barrier. There are other barriers. There's the barrier of natural language. You may be speaking to people for whom English is not the first language. By the way, I'm one of those. I've gotten pretty good at it over the years, but I came here not speaking a word of English. And I sometimes still have difficulty with American slang. So now let me notice we have allies in the room. Let me also speak lovingly to the Americans in the room. No one else knows anything about American baseball. Please stop using American baseball metaphors on phone calls. They just don't know what you're talking about. So, we're at the bottom of the ninth. What the heck is that? And now let me say, I'm from Colonel Regis's country. I am a Brazilian. I'm a proud Brazilian. And we Brazilians know that footballs are shaped like balls. And they're moved with a foot. And just as with American baseball, most of our allies don't know a thing about American football. So it's third down. Nobody knows what that means. No one has a clue what that means except Americans and Canadians. We need to recognize that when we're speaking to people from other cultures with other languages, American sports metaphors aren't very helpful, but they're very commonly used. And we need to see that as a barrier. We need to find ways to speak that doesn't assume an intimate knowledge of peculiarly American institutions. And that's a barrier. And we need to recognize that barrier, and we need to adapt in order to prevent that misunderstanding. Another barrier. We may not be trusted, and lack of trust is a barrier. And we need to think really carefully about whether there is someone who is trusted. Or, in the absence of trust, what can we do to make it more likely that they will believe what we have to say? But until we identify that lack of trust is a barrier, we're unlikely to adapt in ways that get people to actually want to hear what we have to say. So there are physical barriers, technology. There are cultural barriers, including language and particular cultural vocabulary. There's also the issue of the TLAs. You know what the TLAs are. Those are the three-letter acronyms. Yeah, you can let that sink in. Yeah, there's TLAs, those are the three-letter acronyms. There's also the FLAs, the four-letter acronyms, which are not to be confused with the FLAs, which is the five-letter acronyms. And it's not unique to people in uniform, but there's a tendency to use a lot of acronyms, and there's a tendency to assume that the other people we're talking to know exactly what those acronyms mean, and I'm here to attest we don't. So it's important not to default to acronym talk. But we do it all the time in small groups. When we do it in heterogeneous groups, the likelihood of misunderstanding is very, very high. So the effective leader takes these barriers very seriously. The effective leader honors these barriers. I'm going to say that again. The effective leader honors the barriers and then asks, can these barriers be overcome? Can these barriers be overcome? And if the answer is no, my counsel is don't communicate. If the answer to the question, can these barriers be overcome, is no, then I have to wonder, why the heck would you want to communicate? If the barrier is so severe that your message will not get through to the people whom you're trying to move, and they will not be moved, and they will not think, feel, know, and do what you need them to, then why go through the trouble and confuse people or squander resources, including your valuable time? Once you figure out whether the barrier can be overcome, you then ask, how do we overcome it? The most effective way to overcome it is to adapt the way you were planning to engage. But if you conclude you can't overcome it, don't communicate. Imagine how much more time you would have if you didn't get swamped by ineffective communication. Imagine how much more time you would have if you didn't have to go to a bunch of meetings where the purpose wasn't clear and where the outcome wasn't determined. The effective leader uses communication to move processes forward, not just to speak or send something because it happens to be a particular day in the calendar. It is only when you've done these 4 steps that you are anywhere close to being able to actually prepare communication. And that's the 5th step. The 5th step, given what you learned in steps 1, 2, 3, and 4, but particularly given what you learned in step 4, you then ask, what do the people who matter to us need to see, need to hear? What do they need to experience? What do they need to participate in if they are to know and think and feel and do what you want them to? So what do they need to do? What do they need to see? What do they need to hear? What do they need to experience? What do they need to participate in order to change the way you want them to change? Write that down. And then ask, given what they need to experience, who is the most influential person that will cause them to experience that? And you may conclude that the person you had initially thought would be doing the communication is not the right person to communicate. It may be someone down the chain of command, and maybe somebody across the chain of command, but it may not be you. And that's okay, because it's never about you. Leadership is never about you. It's about moving others to do and think and feel and know what you need them to. Given who the most influential person then is, then what's the most influential thing to be said, either in writing or in person or in some other form? What is the most influential message that will get people to experience what you need them to experience? And then finally, what is the most effective medium through which they ought to experience it? And one of the things we find is a meeting that was initially thought to be a town hall meeting, we're going to talk to all of our people at the same time. By the time you go through this analysis, you realize maybe talking to all of our people at the same time is not the most effective way. Maybe we need to get an immediate supervisor to talk to just their smaller team. And you get clarity about what's likely to work. And you change the medium through which you were going to do it and the person through whom you were going to do it, because you've gone through those previous 4 steps. And sir, I saw a vigorous nod when I said that. Does that seem to resonate with you? Yeah. If you do fewer big meetings and more small meetings, what is the consequence? Oh, by the way, usually it's pretty good. There are good reasons to have big meetings, there are good reasons to have small meetings, but Tuesday is never a good reason. Just the calendar is never a good reason. There has to be a predictable outcome that is the optimal outcome from that form of engagement. And it's only when you've done all of that that you then have the ability to actually figure out, what do we need? Do we need PowerPoint? Okay, at this point you can ask the question, do we need PowerPoint? Do we have the ability to generate that PowerPoint? Can we generate PowerPoint so that it only creates the experience we need them to experience up in the first part of step 5? What else do we need? How do we organize? How do we mobilize? How do we prepare? Most communication that is done unstrategically, ineffectively, starts here. And we need to start at the beginning and move our way down. When we follow the sequence, we end up having much more predictably productive communication. There is a rigor to doing it right. And that rigor means we always start with purpose, we then move to people, we then move to the change in the people, and then the hard work is figuring out what matters to those people. And it's only when we figure that out do we then move to, okay, how do we actually organize the communication? Yes, feel free to take that photograph. Thank you. You'll also get a piece of paper or an electronic version of a piece of paper when all of this is done.